Now, if you're anything like me, your first experience in Grease Pencil can be quite tormenting. It's a bit different from other drawing programs, and there's good things and bad things about that. One of the bad things is it's quite hard to learn. Well, in this complete beginner's guide, I'm going to try and put it into its simplest forms and give you the absolute basics. But I'll also try and demystify it slightly because I'll show you some of the pitfalls that you might fall into accidentally, and in some ways highlight why things are the way they are. And by the end of the video, you should be happy drawing and creating within Grease Pencil. This video, whilst it briefly looks at the 3D aspects, will only concentrate on the 2D aspects to start with. In subsequent videos, I'll look at the 3D aspects of Grease Pencil and animation. Before we start, I want to point out that I'm using a display tablet with my pen. If you're just starting out, it's fine to use a mouse. If you're getting kind of interested in 2D art, then you will want a graphics tablet of some description. You can have a basic tablet to start off with. If you start to really enjoy it, then upgrade to a display tablet. They are more expensive, but they are that much easier. Almost all graphics tablets come with pens that have buttons on them and you can program them. You'll want to have that for Blender because you will want to set up Blender with the pen button, this first button, to be middle mouse button. If you have second buttons, then you might want to choose one as right click. In Blender, we do rely a lot on keyboard shortcuts, so make sure your keyboard is in a comfortable position next to your tablet. Okay, so let's jump into Grease Pencil. Just before we start, Blender does update regularly, so do check the description for any updates and I'll try and post them in there. Otherwise, I'll create a new video and the link will be in the description. So when you open Blender, if you're opening it for the very first time, then you'll see a screen about settings and you can just choose the default. Once you've done that, you'll see a splash screen, which will look something like this. Now you have to remember that Blender is primarily a 3D program with 2D options within it. So you've got options of the type of file you want to create. A general will take you into the 3D workspace, but 2D animation is where we want to go with Grease Pencil, especially when we're starting out. So I'll click on 2D animation, and that takes us into the 2D animation workspace, where we can see what is called the 3D viewport, but it's set up for 2D here. And you can see that on the top left. You can see the different types of window available, and this one is the 3D viewport, and it's been set up in a 2D way. So within the 3D window is like the canvas, and that's where we'll do our drawing. Underneath that, we've got what's called the dope sheet, and it's set to Grease Pencil mode. Underneath that, we've got a tiny window, which is the timeline. We won't be using the timeline at all because that's for animation. The dope sheet's quite good for showing you your layers and the animation that you can see on those layers. Over on the side here, we've got the outliner, which is all the objects in our scene. And underneath that, we've got the properties window, which has things like the brush settings and so forth. Okay, so that's the interface. What I'm going to do is just draw something in our scene to start us off. So we've already got the brush selected up here, and we've got a certain type of brush, which is called the pencil down here. And I'll just draw a basic circle like this. And you might want to follow along and do the same. Now, because I'm using a graphics tablet, when I draw a stroke, the harder I press, the more ink will come out, and the softer I press, the less. And those options are the pen pressure, which you can see highlighted there under strength and radius. I'll just undo that stroke though. What I want to show you is that we are in a 3D program. So if I press the middle mouse button now and move around my scene, you can see it in 3D. So holding down the middle mouse button by itself will move you around in 3D. Using the wheel of my mouse or holding down the middle mouse button if you've got your pen set up and pressing Control will zoom in and out. And holding down Shift and middle mouse button will strafe side to side. So those are the 3D controls, but we generally want to stay in 2D. The reason I'm showing you this is because if you accidentally press the middle mouse button and go into 3D view, you can easily go back to the kind of 2D canvas by just tapping on the camera button here. And if I hover over that, you can see it's numpad 0 is the shortcut. So if your viewport goes a bit weird, numpad 0 or the camera button there. Now the controls are still the same, so I can hold down Control, middle mouse button, and zoom in and out, and you can actually see my canvas size there, which is actually called the camera in Blender because it's a 3D program. And then Shift middle mouse button will move me around my canvas like so. So we'll zoom in a little bit on our circle just there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the brushes. So I've got my brush tool selected here. And incidentally, when I hover over, you can see that it's got some shortcut keys there. Disregard those for the moment because they're not actually working in this current version. But when I click on the brush icon here, it will choose my default brush down here. And I've got these brushes all the way from the airbrush through to the soft pencil. Those are the brushes. If I tick on the eraser, you'll see it take me to my default eraser, which is eraser hard. And there's different options for my eraser there. And then the fill brush takes me to this fill brush at the end here. So let's try a different brush. I'll go back to my brush settings. Again, that takes me to my default pencil. I'm going to change it to the ink pen because I think that's more fun, and draw a circle with that. So you can see the ink pen is pressure sensitive for its size, but not its strength. I much prefer this one because it gives that nice cartoony look. Now, if we want to change the radius, we can press the F key and that will change it, and move my mouse to the side and that will change the size of my brush, as you can see there. I'll just make that a bit smaller again. You can also see the radius up the top here as well. It's a little bit fine to adjust, and you can click in the middle and drag up and down and hold down Shift for small increments. So if I hold down Shift, I can go a bit finer, but it is generally much easier just with the F key. The strength up here, if I change the strength, you can see the strength changes and I can go over it and slowly get to black. You can change that with Shift F. So you can see the strength changing there, and I'll bring it back all the way out to 1 and then start drawing it. And you can see I've changed the strength. So F for the radius and Shift F for the strength. Okay, it's getting a bit messy here. If I move my mouse between two windows, the cursor changes and I can actually resize the windows slightly. So let's bring up the dope sheet so you can see the layers. We've got a lines layer, which I'm currently working on. Anything that's highlighted yellow, that's the active object or tool or layer. So in this case, it's lines is active, and there's a fills layer as well. Now we can also find that over here under the object data properties. If I click on that, you can see the layers there. I can bring out this window a little bit so you can see that more easily. Now these layers work in the same way as a program like Photoshop, where the lines layer in this case is above the fills layer. So if I hide the lines layer, we've got this empty fills layer underneath it. So if I bring back the lines layer, you can see all my details there. So how do I clear up this mess? Well, I could use the eraser brush. So I'll jump to the eraser brush here, and we're on eraser hard at the moment, and I can go around deleting some of this mess. Up the top here, we do have some options of the radius and strength, but next to that, we've also got dissolve, point, and stroke. So if I click on point and start using the eraser tool, it seems to be working in a harder way to the dissolve option. If I click on stroke and then tap on these strokes here, you can see it deleting the whole stroke. So what's it doing here? Well, let's go back to the brush. And when I click on the brush now, you can see that it goes back to my ink pen. So it goes back to the one you had selected before you changed the brushes. So let's draw again a circle. And to understand the difference between these eraser settings, dissolve, point, and stroke, I'll just quickly go back to my pen. I'll go up to what's known as edit mode. So we're currently on draw mode, and I can change to edit mode. Now I can left click and drag to select everything, and you can see it highlight yellow. And there seems to be an extra object that didn't delete properly over the edge here. But you can see that it's selecting my stroke. Let's zoom in a bit, so control middle mouse button and zoom in. So it's selecting this entire stroke. I can box select this one, and you can see it's box selecting some points along there. So I can box select this, shift box select that, and press delete, and then just delete, and it will delete that area. So that's how you can get rid of any strange anomalies that might appear, especially when you're deleting bits. And let's click on our stroke in the middle here that we've just created. Now notice up the top here next to edit mode, we've got a selection mode. If I go to points, you can see all those points there. So remember, with the eraser brush, we could choose dissolve, points, or stroke. These are the points, and you can actually select these and then press G to grab to move them. So G is the move tool, but just remember G to grab. But I'll undo that because I don't like the look of that. But you can see I can select points along my stroke. That can be quite useful. Or, of course, the stroke tool here, so I can select the stroke and it's selecting the whole thing. The last one is segments. I don't really find much of a use for that. You might have some strokes that have obvious segments, but you'll generally be using stroke and very rarely maybe the points. Okay, so we're in edit mode and we can go back to draw mode, and I'll go back to my pencil and I can continue drawing. Let's look quickly now at the other useful mode. So we've got draw mode, edit mode. The other useful one is sculpt. So sculpt mode just here, and you can see the brushes change down the bottom. I think the most useful brush is probably the grab brush just in the middle here. There's some other fun ones that you can try out. The default is the smooth brush, and I'll just show you. If I make my brush nice and big, it kind of straightens it out. Could possibly be useful, but I find it a little bit awkward to work with. I'll undo that, and I'll go to the grab brush, which I think is the most useful. And again, I'll resize my brush. I'm using F to do that. And I can change this circle, zoom out a bit, and make my brush a bit bigger. I could change this circle so it becomes more round. Notice this is being affected over here as well, because it does affect everything on the layer you've got selected and other layers if you don't lock them, which I'll talk about in a moment. But you can see how useful this sculpt brush can be, just adjusting your strokes. Okay, let's go back to draw mode. So up the top here, across to draw mode. I'll use the eraser tool. I'm on stroke, so I can just click on this stroke to delete that. And if you want to be absolutely sure that you've deleted it, let's just check in edit mode. You can see that it is completely gone. Sometimes when you erase things in the dissolve mode, it can leave just a little edge and things which you have to delete. And edit mode is the best place for that. So back to draw mode. Let's look at some of the other options. The first one I want to point you to is this lovely tool here, the trim. If I click on that, I can get rid of these sort of overlapping lines like this. And I think that's a really handy tool. Let's go back to the draw brush for a moment and let's draw some ears in for our face. I can then go to the trim tool and kind of circle select or lasso select, I suppose you'd call it, these extra little bits here. It doesn't always get them perfectly, but it can be really useful for those overlapping segments. So a lot of the time it's very useful when you're drawing to purposely overlap, and then you can go in and cut those. Okay, I'll continue drawing my delightful face in the middle here, and then we can talk about the fill brush and layers. So currently I've been drawing on my lines layer just here, and that's the same as the lines layer down here. So this little icon here, the object data properties, shows you the layers. And you'll notice we have an extra fill layer here. So I'll click on the fill layer. Notice it turns orange over here, showing us it's the active object. In the side panel here, it highlights blue, so it's obvious that it's selected. And it is very important to know which layer you're drawing on. You can make lots of mistakes drawing on the wrong layer. But in the fill layer, let's actually fill in our shape. Well, we've got a fill brush just here. And you can see when I press this, it takes us to the fill brush, which is down here. Now, the problem is I've got my fill brush selected, but if I try and fill anything, nothing happens. So you'd expect I'll be filling in these shapes. Well, the problem being is that I'm still on solid stroke for my material. So if I go back to the pen tool here, you can see ink pen up the top here. So that's the same as the ink pen down here. Next to that, we have the material it's using. This can be complicated for beginners to understand, but at the moment we've got solid stroke, so I can draw my solid stroke, but I can change this to other options. Those options can also be found down under materials here. And you can see those same options there as we can see there. And it's really important to understand that these are kind of like paint buckets. I've been using the solid stroke so far for all these strokes. The great thing about this is at any point I can change the color down here to something like a blue. And they all change. Anything that's using that stroke will change. Really useful, really effective, but you have to be aware of that. So I'll bring this back down to black. I'll just quickly show you the other options before I go to solid fill. So there's square strokes, and you can see if I draw like this, it turns into square strokes. It doesn't matter how fast you go as to how many squares you've got. I don't particularly like that brush, so I'll get rid of that. And then you've got dots as well. And again, turns into dots, which might be useful. You can delete these by going across to the materials and just deleting them there. So I'll delete the square stroke and the dot, and we're left with our solid fill and solid stroke. So on my fill layer, you can see the fill layer is selected there, and that corresponds to the layers here. I'll just hide it and show it because this stroke here I did on the fill layer. So just be aware of that for when I try and delete it later. Let's go back to the materials. So I'm on solid fill, and let's change across to our fill brush just here. So that's the fill brush. Notice the icon changes over here as well. So we've got fill and solid fill. We're on our fill layer. I can now click and hopefully fill in. But again, it doesn't fill in. This is the funny thing about Blender. There's so many options, it can get confusing. However, double tap and it will fill in. It's kind of asking me where I want to fill first, and then you kind of have to confirm with a double tap. So let's fill in the ears as well. So there's one there, double tap, and double tap there. So remember to double tap with the fill brush. Now, I don't particularly like this gray color. So again, we've got this great option of going down to our base color here and changing it. So let's give them a sort of skin type color, nice and bright, nice and pink like this. And it changes each of those fills that we're using the solid fill paint bucket. Now, one thing to be aware of, under the materials in surface, you've got both stroke and fill, and you've got colors for the stroke and colors for the fill. The fill brush is automatically turned on with the fill and off for the stroke. If I go back to the solid stroke, you can see that the stroke is selected and the fill is unselected. So just be aware of that. If you're trying to change the color here, for example, and nothing's happening, that's because you're changing the stroke. Okay, so what about the mouth and the eyes? Do I have to fill those in with white, or can I remove them from my fill layer? Well, you can remove them from the fill, and you can kind of eraser fill material. So to create new materials, I go across to my material panel. I can press the plus sign here, and it creates a new slot, and then you can click new for a new material. In here, I can rename it, and I'll rename this eraser fill. and press enter, turn off the stroke and turn the fill on. And we don't have to worry about the base color. The option we tick is the hold out. This is basically turning it into an eraser brush. So I'll tick that and then double tap on the mouth and that erases that fill, double tap on the eye and the other one. And we've managed to erase those fill areas. And this is all happening on the fill layer. Just to show you that, I'll hide the fill layer and bring it back again. And now's a good time to actually delete this stroke. So let's go to the delete brush, on stroke, click on the stroke and it's deleted. So I've managed to draw a fun little face there using these different materials on 2 separate layers. Okay, what about adding some shading? Let's create a shading layer. So I'll go across to my layers panel here. And again, that's the same as down here. And I can add a new layer. I can add it up here or down here even, but I'll add it up here. It's a little bit easier here because we can have a long line and it gets a bit busy down here. So I've added a new layer. I can double tap on it to rename it. So I'll call this shadow fill, and that's going to be my shadows. The layer order does matter. We want the shadow fill to be on top of the fills and obviously the lines to be on top of all of our fills. So with that shadow fill layer selected, I could draw in a shadow. So I'll go to the brushes, down to my fill brush. I could have done that a bit quicker. I was on the eraser here. I could just click the fill brush here, hence why these brushes are a little bit easier to use than these ones over here. So at the moment, I'm on eraser fill. I need a new material. So that's the materials here and the materials over here. I need a new material to fill in some shadow. So again, click new material, new here. We don't want it to be a stroke, we want it to be a fill. And a black color should work fine. We can always change it. But with my fill brush selected, how do I fill it in so I just fill in an area? I'll undo that because we don't want to fill in his face with black. I just want to draw an area down here with a fill brush. For that, we can go back up to the brush options. And it doesn't matter which type of brush you have here because that only affects the stroke. If you have the stroke unselected and the fill selected, you kind of get this interesting fill brush which works like a lasso. And you probably want to experiment a little bit with this first because it takes a moment to understand, but you can see how that can fill in an area. Now, if I turn the stroke on as well, I'll turn this stroke to a different color, so it's blue. You can see that these brushes will now actually matter for the outline. We've got some different weird and wonderful brushes here that you can experiment with yourself. But when I turn the stroke off, you can see it doesn't matter which brush you have selected. I'm just going to undo those strokes rather than delete them. It's a bit quicker. And again, with the brush selected, I'll turn it back to my ink pen, which I seem to be using the most. Again, that doesn't matter. The most important thing is that we've got this fill option here and we're using this material. I'm going to actually rename this shadow material and notice it changes down here as well as up here. And then I can draw my shadow. So I'll come down here for a shadow up to here. And I can overlap a little bit like this as well. I'll show you how you can edit and change that so it just affects the fills layer or that face layer. It can be a little bit tricky to see when it's fully black because you've got lines in black as well. So I could have changed this to something like a blue instead, and then I'd be able to actually see what I'm drawing over, as you can see there. So I'll undo that. And again, I'll undo those, change that to a blue, and then we can actually see our line a little bit easier and draw it like that. So we've got a man with a beard at the moment. Okay, so how do we get this shadow fill to only affect the face layer? Well, in here, in the layer options, you've got some options over here. They are the same again. If we go back to our layer options here, we've got the same things here. You can see blend mode there, regular, opacity, and so forth. So these are the same as these. What we've also got is an option of masks. So masks are something where you hide or show things. So if I tick on masks in the drop down, if I add now the fills layer, it will only affect the fills layer. So under masks, we can say, what layer do you want this to affect? So we've managed to create a shadow layer, but notice on the ear, the shadow isn't really working. I want it down at the bottom here. So I'm going to have to delete this area. Now with the fill brush, it's actually a little bit awkward. What I'm going to do is just go to the fills layer, and with my brushes, I'll use the shadow material and let's create a fill layer here. If I want to delete part of it, you'd think you'd go to the eraser brush and erase it out. And it's not really working with the dissolve brush, which you can see here. However, I'll undo that. If I change the point and use this dissolve brush, it seems to do a better job. So I'll undo those changes, go back to my shadow fill layer, and with my eraser brush, I should be able to swipe across here and delete it, but something's gone wrong again. I'll undo that. This is because the eraser brush will affect all layers. And that's where we use the lock option just here. I can lock my layers. You can find that as well in the layers panel here, of course, and you can see they're both locked now. Now I should be able to go across my shadow fill and delete those areas. Unfortunately, it is just getting this area here. So a little bit of a limitation there. Let's go back to my brush though, back to my material. I'm using the shadow material and I can just fill this area in again. Okay, so that's deleting areas. And I might want a little bit of shadow on the ears here. So I can, again, with my shadow fill layer, draw a little shape here. And maybe just at the bottom of this ear as well, just there. So I've got some shadow going on. But I think this shadow layer is far too harsh. Well, under the layer properties just here, and you can see the layer properties in here as well. Remember, they're the same. We've got some blend mode options and opacity options. I could just turn the opacity down, but as well as the opacity, the blend mode's quite useful. So multiply will just darken these areas where I've filled in. The multiply is a bit nicer because it just darkens rather than is an overlay of a color. So I don't have to be so precise of the color I've chosen. And I can bring down the opacity to, let's say, something around here where we've got a nice light shadow there. Okay, so what if I'm not happy with the exact shape of my shadows? Well, that's where we can go across to sculpt mode, remember? So sculpt mode, just make sure you're on the correct layer and the other layers are locked. So this is my shadow fill layer. Remember, I can bring these windows out so you can read that a little bit easier. So shadow fill layer there. F to resize the brush. And maybe I can bring this shadow up a bit here, bring it down here. Just make my brush a bit smaller and the ear can have a smaller shadow like so, or something like this. Maybe that one could be a bit bigger. And you get the idea probably. Now I'll just zoom in, so control middle mouse button, and you can see there's a slight issue here. I can generally sort that out with the sculpt tool, but just be aware if you get issues like that, we can go back in with our fill brush and fill that area in if we need to. But it looks like I can just sculpt it away. So the sculpt tool is very useful in that sense. If I'm not happy with my lines, then I can lock this layer, go to my lines layer. So again, active layers are highlighted in orange or highlighted up here. It's grayed out here though because it's locked, so I need to unlock it and then I can affect my lines and sort out my curves if I needed to. Now, a few really useful tips. If I hover over a viewport and press Control Spacebar, it takes me to full screen mode. It's a nice, easy way of kind of zooming in or jumping into the viewport window. And Control Spacebar will take me back. So Control Spacebar, zoom in as it were to that one window. You've also got back to previous just here. So let's say I'm very happy with my smiley face here and I want to render. If I press Control middle mouse button and zoom out, you can see it's taking up a fair bit of the canvas, but not that much. And you're probably asking, how do I export this as a picture? Well, you've got the output properties just here. On the side here, you've got the kind of canvas size, which is actually the camera size. And I could change this to a square, so 1080 by 1080. Notice it actually makes it bigger rather than brings it in, which seems a bit strange, but it sort of makes sense because the camera stays in its position and changes size. So it's just changing the resolution. So there's two ways of kind of zooming into our object. We can either make the object bigger or make our camera move in to the object. To move the camera in, probably the easiest way is to make sure you're on camera mode. We are on camera mode just here, and there's a lock icon here, and we can control middle mouse button to zoom in, and that's locking the camera, so it's moving the camera in at the same time. And if I hold down Shift, we can move this character into position. Looks a little bit weird because we're bringing the grid up there. Don't worry too much about that. Don't panic about it. It's not particularly important, but that's what happens when you zoom in and then strafe around. I can undo that movement with Control Z. The other way of doing it is using object mode. So we're currently in sculpt mode and we can change that across to object mode. That selects our entire object and you can actually see that in the outliner here. We've got our stroke object. Within that stroke, then we've got stroke layers, and you can see our layers there, but we've got one single stroke object. So when we go to object mode, it selects that object. And you can again press the G to grab button to move that around. I'll undo that movement though. There's also the S to scale button, and you can scale that up like so and move that into the middle if you want. Incidentally, R is the rotation button, and you can see it moving around my object center there, this orange dot, which incidentally you can move under the options, tick origins, and then you can press G to grab to move that object origin if you need to. I'm going to undo those changes though and turn off affect only origins. And let's just jump back to draw mode where we're probably a bit more comfortable. So how do we export this out? Well, again, we've got our output here. We've changed the size, the frame rate, and the frame range is for animation. The output is the type of file it's creating. So there's a file format here. And again, if you're doing animation, you'll want to change to something like FFmpeg. But for now, we're fine with just a PNG. And we need to render the scene or make a picture of it, basically. So we go up to the render option here, render image, and you can see our image just there. And that's where we can then press image, save as, and start saving it. And in fact, you can change the file format here as well. I'll close that down and I'll close down this render window. One thing you might want to change as well is the background. That's under the world settings just here. So if I click on world, you can see the color is white. You could change that to whatever you wanted to. I think we'll bring that back to something like this. Nice sort of pale yellowy color. And then again, I can render. The shortcut key is F12 and there's my rendered piece. If you want a transparent background, you'll have to go to the render settings and it's all the way down to film and then transparent just there. And this will actually, when I press F12 now, it's got a transparent background for you, which you might find useful. But I'll turn that off for now. Now, one more tool I haven't really mentioned is the shape tool here. So if I select box, you can see it's using this shadow material. So it's going to use a fill and not a stroke. It's changed back to the pencil. So if there were a stroke on this material, that's what it would be using. And I can then draw a box and you can resize the box, clicking and dragging the corner, and then you press enter to set it. Notice it's got a strength of 0.6 to start off with. So I'll undo that, turn the strength up, and you can see a new box with that full fill power there. And again, press enter. I'll undo that though. There's other options of something like a line, which you might want to use. So I'll choose the line, click and drag, but that's not working because we haven't got a stroke on this particular material. What I'll do is I'll press escape to undo that start of the stroke, go back to my materials. I'll go back to my solid stroke this time, which has just a stroke, no fill. And this time click and drag, put it across. Holding down shift will make a straight line and then let go and press enter to fill it in, as it were. So that's the shape tool just there. I'll undo that though because it doesn't suit my style. Okay, so hopefully you found this all very useful and you've got a nice smiley face. Watch out for the next episode where I'll be going through animation. Thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.